The anti-Semitism that we've seen on the streets of Toronto, city streets across Canada, around the world over the last 7, 8 months has been truly shocking. We knew anti-Semitism was there. We just had not seen its ugly face to the degree that we're witnessing it now. Hi, my name is Brian Lilley, political columnist for the Toronto Sun, joined today by the Godfather. Gad Saad is professor at Concordia University in Montreal. He's a successful YouTuber, a columnist with the National Post. You've seen him everywhere. And if you haven't, well, then this is going to be quite the good introduction for you. Gad, I wanted to have you on because following you online and seeing you talk about it, I can talk about anti-Semitism and the impact it's having, but I'm not Jewish. Anti-Semitism is not a Jewish problem. It's a problem for non-Jews like me. But you deal with the impact of it. And you've got a unique perspective, having lived in Montreal with a strong Jewish community for so long, having, I believe you said your family came to Canada from Lebanon at age 11. Just talk to me for a little bit about how much things have changed since October 7th and with the Hamasnik campers and the protesters and the tentifadas and all of that.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for having me on, Brian. Look, as you mentioned, I grew up in Lebanon. We were part of the last dwindling community of Lebanese Jews that had steadfastly remained in Lebanon, even though my extended family had left Lebanon because the writing was on the wall that it was rather dangerous to be Jewish in the Middle East. But Lebanon supposedly was the Paris of the Middle East, was a more tolerant and progressive place. And so my family had stayed until we could no longer stay because the civil war started and it became impossible to be Jewish in Lebanon. So then we escaped to Montreal, Canada when I was 11. And for the next 25, 30 years, I lived in Montreal. And of course, I also lived for a while in the States. I studied in the States and I was a visiting professor in several universities in the States. But much of my life had been spent in Montreal. But then about 20 years ago, I started seeing some ominous changes. And then I'll come to after October 7 in a second. And the ominous changes manifested themselves in many ways, but one of which was the very clear increase in the Islamic demographic in Montreal, as is the case in, for example, many places in Europe. Now, of course, I don't need...
In Quebec, it was specifically from former French colonies because they were purposely trying to find Francophones.
Exactly.
And they were often going to places in North Africa, for example.
Exactly. So imagine you take the Algerian extremists, fundamentalist extremists who fought against the Algerian government, but then lost that war. And then Quebec says, here's a great idea. Why don't we let them all in the hundreds of thousands to Montreal? Because then if they eventually eradicate everyone in sight, they'll do it, but they'll begin by saying bonjour before they decapitate you. So as long as you're able to address the ones that you're about to kill in French, then all is well. It sounds as though I'm being facetious, but it's almost at that level of imbecility. And so what you end up having is a very, very quick change in the culture.
And this is one of the reasons Montreal had a problem post 9/11 with and in the ISIS era, with a lot of recruits coming from there, a lot of extremism happening was because of where they had recruited new immigrants from areas where there had been wars, where people had extreme beliefs.
Exactly. Now, while I noticed the very rapid Islamization in many areas of Montreal, life was still okay, was still reasonable. I didn't, get attacked on the streets for being Jewish. Nobody bothered me at the university, even though I would get privately students come up to me, Jewish students at Concordia, many years ago, saying, "Hey, we know of your profile. We know that you're Jewish. We know you're a high-profile guy. I just want to let you know that I never wear my kippah or I never wear a Star of David at the university." And this is well before October 7th. But then October 7th happened, and here's the incredible thing, Brian. You would think that after 1,200 people had been butchered, raped, decapitated, and so on. I mean, there are only three things that could happen after such an event. Jew hatred can go down because you empathize with what just happened to Israelis. Jew hatred can stay the same, or Jew hatred can increase. Well, lo and behold, Jew hatred has orgiastically and exponentially increased since October 7th. And I've certainly been a recipient of that Jew hatred. It's usually coming from three sources. There's, of course, the Islamic sources. There's also the neo-Nazi types, Jews won't replace us guys, who also writes and send me all kinds of really lovely messages. And then you get the academic progressive left types, the Jews are Zionists, colonialists, and so on. And so everywhere I turn, Brian, the Jew hatred is coming at me without any respite. So it's been quite a wake-up call, even for someone who grew up in the endemic Jew hatred of the Middle East.
So is it reminding you of what your family finally said we can no longer tolerate?
Absolutely. So now, look, it's not as though I can't walk down the street today and I'm as worried as during the the full-blown Lebanese civil war. But prior to the civil war, so let me just give you a few stories from my childhood and then draw a corollary to what's happening now in Montreal. So when I was 5 years old, Gamal Abdel Nasser, who was the president of Egypt at the time, passed away in 1970. So I was 5, about to turn 6. And as so often happens in the Middle East, when something bad happens, then everybody rushes to the streets in these like sort of very protests with a lot of fervor and incantations and lamentations. And as people were proceeding down my street in Beirut, I was hearing death to Jews, death to Jews. I mean, in Arabic. And so I turned to my mother. I said, why are they calling for the death of Jews? The Egyptian president just passed away, And she's like, shh, just put your head down. Don't make yourself seen. Second, very quick story. And I'll tell you a couple of more stories, and then I'll link it to Montreal. Second story, when I was about 9 or 10 years old, this is 1 year before the Civil War started. The teacher asks the kids to stand up and tell us what they want to be when we grow up. And so, I want to be a policeman, I want to be a doctor, I want to be a nurse, I want to be a soccer player. And then one kid goes up and says, when I grow up, I want to be a Jew killer, to raucous applause and laughter. Now, this kid knew that I was Jewish. This is before the Civil War. Story 3, my brother, one of my brothers, who's 10 years older than me, had been Lebanese champion in judo for several years in a row. And so this is again before the Civil War, before 1975. It became too shameful for a Jew to be Lebanese champion in a combat sport. So he was visited by some men who told him that it was time for him to retire, lest there might be an unfortunate accident that happens to him. Well, here is the irony of life, Brian. In 1976, you might remember that the Olympics happened in Montreal. So in 1973, 1974, he's forced to leave Lebanon to pursue his judo career in France. In 1976, he represents Lebanon in the Montreal Olympics. So the guy who was too Jewish in 1973-74, we can overlook that he was Jewish in 1976 when it was important for him to carry the Lebanese flag at the Montreal Olympics. One more quick story, and then I'll link it to Montreal.
All good.
By the way, all of these stories are told, forgive the shameless plug, but it's important for your viewers and listeners. They're all discussed in the Parasitic Mind in chapter 1, because I'm trying to lay the ground for what happens to a society that is ruled by identity politics, which was the case in Lebanon. Any case, the day that we're leaving Beirut to emigrate to Montreal, Canada, end of October 1975, as we clear the airspace of Lebanon, the captain of the plane says, okay, we've now cleared Lebanese airspace. My mother puts a pendant around my neck with a Star of David and says, now you can wear this and not hide your identity and be proud who you are. Now let's link it to Montreal. 2023, about 2 weeks after October 7th, my wife picks me up with one of our children, our son, who had just played a soccer match in the east end of Montreal. As I walk into the car, she had just picked me up from a cafe where I was working on my laptop. My son looks at me and says, Daddy, if you had been where I just played soccer and you were wearing a Star of David, you'd be dead. And he said it at almost the exact same age that I was in 1975. So in 1975, I leave Lebanon and I can wear a Star of David. In 2023, I better take off the Star of David in Montreal. That hopefully answers your question of what it's like to be in Montreal today.
You still work at the university. You still go there, correct?
Luckily, I'm currently on sabbatical leave, which basically means that I don't have to report for any administrative or teaching duties. So I've had a 6-month respite from campus, but September is coming around, and let me tell you, it seems untenable. So we'll see what happens.
So I worked in Montreal while you were away for a few years, and I saw the beginning of the anti-Semitism at Concordia, and where you work would be ground central. So those videos that so many people have posted of students being attacked at Concordia, forget the Tentifada at McGill. These are students inside university buildings being attacked because they wear a kippah or a Star of David, or they've put up a poster for the hostages. How do you not end up filled with anger and rage?
Well, I am. I try to be pragmatic and optimistic and try to keep fighting the good fight. Try to keep, I wake up every day trying to wake people up. But let me tell you, it's very hard not to be angry and disillusioned. A couple of months ago, I had a Zoom chat with a senior administrator at my university who told me, in the exact same way that I'm looking at you right now via Zoom, there is no such thing as Jew hatred at Concordia. So the level, so it's
So their
baffling.
head is in the sand.
Exactly. And then, of course, about a month after that Zoom meeting, the president of my university is summoned on Parliament Hill to give testimony and admit that, oh yes, no, there is major Jew hatred at my university. So look, this is not to imply that every single person walking around on the university campus is a rabid hater, but you don't know who's a hater and who's not. You don't know who's going to cause you trouble or not.
My
So
guess is it's a small minority, but a friend of mine who works in the polling business likes to say small numbers can be big numbers. And the first time he said that to me, I said, "Well, what do you mean?" He said, "Well, if just 5% of Canadians are raging anti-Semites, that's still 2 million adults."
well,
That's a lot of people to be worried about.
let me contextualize that number in a much more negative way. There's the Pew polling outfit are
Yeah.
certainly they're nonpartisan, respectable outfit that does global surveys on all sorts of issues. I think it was in 2010 they took a survey across many Islamic countries, exploring how the people of different countries, so it could be Egypt, could be Syria, could be Lebanon, could be Pakistan, what do they feel for the Jews, right? Now, your friend, the example that you gave, you said, well, if it's 5% of Canadians that are anti-Semite, boy, that's a big number. Well, let me contextualize that number for you, Brian. Across all those cultures, not every single one of them, some of them were in the 70s, but in many cultures, it was 95 to 99% of the surveyed people had endemic Jew hatred, towards the Jews. So let me repeat that. So if I sample 1,000 people, 950 of the randomly sampled people exhibit negative views of the Jews. So now let's see if we can close that circle. If I let in hundreds of thousands of people into my society that hail from those cultures, does it take a fancy professor to predict whether Jew hatred will be on the up or down in Canada? So, oh my God, Jew hatred is up in Canada. What could have caused this? It's a mystery.
Well, there's the two sides, and we'll talk about the other side in a minute, that being the academic side. But I mean, my major issue with how the current government has dealt with immigration and multiculturalism is their view of multiculturalism does not include standing up for Canadian values, unless Canadian values means voting Liberal. And so there is not the push to say, as you come to Canada, you leave your old hatreds behind.
Exactly.
Now, my parents came here from Glasgow. That's a city that was a mini Belfast at one point, with the hatred, the violence. They did not associate with uh, an awful lot of Protestants in Glasgow. Guess what happened when they came here? They did. You left your old hatreds behind. My neighborhood was filled with people who came from conflict zones. They left their old struggles behind. We don't tell people to do that anymore. And when Ontario Premier Doug Ford suggested that a little while ago at a news conference, oh my goodness, you're blaming immigrants for violence. You're horrible. You're racist. That's part of what is going on in Canada right now.
Right. So a couple of things to unpack there. Multiculturalism, small m, could be a very good thing. So, for example, if I say Concordia is a multicultural campus, well, that's nice, and that there are people from there's a rich tapestry of ethnicities, of languages, of cultural
Yeah.
heritage, and it adds a vibrancy to the place. That's good. Multicultural with a capital M as a political philosophy, as originally enacted by the father of the current prime minister, is a terrible idea, because it is actually founded on a idea pathogen, a parasitic idea, which I discuss in The Parasitic Mind. And that idea parasite is called cultural relativism. Cultural relativism says it is imperialistic of you to judge the cultural beliefs and the religious beliefs of another society. That's a form of colonization. It's a form of imperialism. Who are you to judge such things as honor brides, or honor killings, or child brides, or cutting off of clitorises of little girls? Don't you have no right to judge the ways of another culture. If you remember, our current prime minister, when he was an MP, and Stephen Harper, his government was putting out a leaflet saying these are certain actions that we don't tolerate in Canada because they're barbaric. If you remember, in a very exaggerated manner, Justin Trudeau, with his flowing hair, went on camera and was very angered by the fact that Harper had used the word barbaric in describing those practices. He wasn't upset because those practices are barbaric. He was upset that someone referred to them as barbaric, because here you have language creates reality. We need to be empathetic in our language. Don't call people illegal, call them undocumented immigrants. Don't call people rapists. That marginalizes the noble rape community, right? And so we can get into Justin Trudeau if you want, but that whole idea of multiculturalism with a capital M comes from a dreadful political philosophy. If you come to Canada, you abide, as you said, by our foundational values. If you don't want to leave those at the door, then we'll send you back to where you came from.
Yeah, well, so I was just trying to look up the name, couldn't find it quickly, of the gentleman I always I used to use on TV years ago, on this cultural relativism idea, that all cultures are equal, or that we should accept everything from all cultures. When the British ruled India, there was a practice of sati. If a man died, the wife had to be thrown on his funeral pyre and be burnt to death. And I wish I had his name, but the British governor, local governor, said, stop this. And they said, well, that's our custom. We're going to do our custom. And he said, in my country, our custom is to hang men who kill women. So you keep your custom and I'll keep mine. And
Exactly.
guess what? The practice ended. I'm not going to say that it ended completely. I'm sure it was still practiced elsewhere, but they weren't openly throwing women on top of the burning heap of their husband's funeral pyre. The idea that we just accept all cultures, I mean, that is a parasitic idea, but part of the parasitic mind. So,
and by the way, it comes originally. So in The Parasitic Mind, in my 2020 book, I describe all of these parasitic ideas and I explain where they originate from. Regrettably, as I sit here as a 3 decades long professor, all of these dreadful ideas come from academia because it takes intellectuals to come up with some of the dumbest ideas. Well, this particular one, cultural relativism, comes from Franz Boas, who was a anthropologist at, if I remember, Columbia University. This is about 100 years ago. And many anthropologists had seen that biology can be misused by all sorts of cretins, right? So social, quote, Darwinists, British class elitists said, hey, we're the upper class. You guys are the lower class. If you die out in your tuberculosis-laden neighborhoods, well, who cares? That's just natural selection. That's just the Darwinian struggle. The Nazis came along later and said, hey, there's a natural struggle between races. Sorry, Jews. Sorry, gypsies. Sorry, homosexuals. You lost out in the Darwinian race. Hey, it's only natural that we exterminate you. And so because all sorts of miscreants misused evolutionary theory, anthropologists decided, well, what if we were to create a new vision of what human behavior looks like that completely rejects the fact that human beings are biological beings? Because if you accept the fact that human beings are biological beings, that means there is a shared biological heritage. There are absolute moral truths. But if we say that everything is relative, all cultures are relative, everything is idiosyncratic, there is no such thing as a human or moral universal, then we can reduce the likelihood that people will misuse biology in the future. So in the service of what originally seemed like a noble goal, you end up murdering and raping truth in the service of that goal. And what I argue in each of those parasitic ideas, it always starts off as a noble goal, right? So for example, radical feminism started off as equity feminism. Well, equity feminism basically says, hey, men and women should be treated equally under the law. There is no reason why a man should be paid more than a woman for the exact same job.
Mm-hmm.
Based on that tenet, you and I would say, yeah, sign me up. I'm an equity feminist. The problem then comes when radical feminists say, well, in the pursuit of eradicating the sexist patriarchal status quo, let's now promulgate the idea that men and women are indistinguishable from each other, that there is no such thing as an evolutionary-based sex difference between men and women. It's all due to social construction. By saying that, maybe we could get rid of the patriarchy more quickly. So it starts off in a noble manner, and then it metamorphosizes into complete gunk.
So how then did the academy become so anti-Semitic? Because if you listen to the old anti-Semitic tropes, well, Jews control the university and Jews control the media. Let me tell you, if that's true, you're doing a really bad job of it, Gad, because both the academic world and my world of media filled with anti-Semitism. So why are you doing such a bad job controlling all these things? No, on the serious note, how did the academy, the academic world, become so anti-Semitic?
So there are several possible explanations here, and several of them work in tandem. So in terms of the current strain of, the Zionist, we love Jews, it's just we hate Zionists, wink, wink. There, what you're doing is there's been about 30, 40, 50 years of infiltration within the political science departments, or some departments they're called Near East Studies, or in the past they used to call them Oriental Studies, meaning the Mid-Orient, the Middle East. All these programs have been completely hijacked by one narrative. And let me summarize that narrative for you so that I can save your children $80,000 a year from being parasitized at Columbia University. Until 1948, Jews and noble, peaceful Palestinians lived hand in hand together, walking around singing John Lennon's Imagine. It was all beautiful. There was nothing but love in the Middle East. Then in 1948, there are some really, really nasty white Zionist colonialists who came from Europe, because Jews have absolutely no ancestral claim to that land. There is absolutely no evidence that Jews have ever existed in Judea, right? And so therefore they came there. And then since 1948, they've been involved in a systematic genocide and eradication of the noble, peaceful Palestinian people. But although their population has grown fivefold during that time. So not only are we really bad in leading the academy, as you were joking earlier, we also suck at committing genocide because the population has grown fivefold. So if you are a moronic, lobotomized 20-year-old who walks into a classroom and that's what's being taught to you. Well, what do you then, is it surprising that you would wear your KKK keffiyeh and go out and say free Palestine? Because you have absolutely no clue. Your professor told you that the Jews have these really nasty Zionist tanks and the Palestinians only have slingshots to fight with you, right?
Yeah.
You're not told the rest of the story. So that's one type of Jew hatred that comes out of academia. Another one that's not necessarily specific to only academics, here I'm going to get psychological for a second. There is a mechanism in psychology called the self-serving bias. The self-serving bias is the idea that human beings have this uncanny ability of attributing successes internally and failures externally. So I did really well on the exam because I'm a smart guy and I studied hard. On the other hand, if I did very poorly on the exam, well, that's because Professor Saad is he's a mean guy. He's a Zionist. He's a Jew. That's why I did poorly. So people, and now you can understand why people have that self-serving bias, because it's an ego protection mechanism. All successes are because of my disposition. All failures are because of the outside world. Now imagine if you can use the Jew as the ultimate source of all your failures, the external, right? So if you get diabetes, it's the fault of the Jew. If your wife just cheated on you, it's because it's the Jew who put those lascivious ideas in her head, because Jews are the ones who peddle pornography. So this is why I've created a game called 6 Degrees of Jew. It's similar to 6 Degrees of Kevin Bacon, but what I do basically is I offer you a calamity and I give you up to 6 causal links to link it to the Jews. So let's play the game if you want.
Okay.
Okay.
It's a bizarre game, but okay.
An Amazonian frog just died in the Amazon. Please blame the Jew in 6 or fewer steps. Maybe you won't be able to come up with it, but believe me, I post these on social media and people play along many times facetiously, and they always are able to blame the Jew in 6 or fewer steps. Can I just say one more thing and then I'll turn this? Yeah. So let me give you an example of how that actually operates, not facetiously. So I put up on social media. So are you familiar with the British grooming gangs, euphemistically
Yeah,
called
yeah.
grooming gangs? Okay. So up and down England, all over, from very small towns to larger towns, Huddersfield, Rockdale, Rotherham, Oxford, everywhere, up and down, Newcastle, everywhere. There are, for the past 25, 30 years, industrial scale level grooming and gang rapes of young white British girls by Asian men. They're Asian, but by the way, I'm also Asian. I'm from Lebanon, but they don't mean Asian Jews, right? Because it's a euphemism for men of a certain religious ideology. Okay, so I put up a not lineup. What do you call the mugshots? The mugshots of the gang. I think they're called the Gang of 20 of Huddersfield, which is a small town in England. Now, just to summarize for you their names, it's Muhammad, Ahmad, Ahmad, Muhammad, Ahmad, 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 Muhammad, 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 Hussein, Hussein, Muhammad. So I put this up on social media and I said, I'm not smart enough to be able to see what unifying theme there is across these men. Could anybody help me? Guess what a lot of people wrote to me, not facetiously. Who did they blame?
Oh, you.
Why? Do you
Because
know
you're
why?
Jewish.
No, but why? Why is it when 3 Muhammads gang raped the British girl, it's Mordechai to blame? Why?
I have no idea.
It's because it's the Jews who operate behind the scenes in an open border cabal. So who let them? By the way, that's insanely false. But never let facts get in the way of a good Jew
So
hating
they're
story.
claiming that these grooming gangs, which are real, that they, I've had people deny them for years. That's why I have to say they're real. That they exist because of an open border policy pushed by some Jewish cabal in the background.
Absolutely. Same thing in Canada. Same thing. Because, so I'll give you one example of that argument. George Soros is a Hungarian Jew, although, Jew in quotes, not much of a Jew, but okay, he's Jewish. He was an acolyte of Karl Popper, who was a Jewish philosopher who started the whole movement of the open society. And therefore, with his billions of dollars, George Soros is pushing the idea of the open society. So ultimately, the causal machination behind the fact that three Muhammads raped your daughter can always be linked back to the Jew, right? Now, of course, by the way, that's insanely false in that it's not true that when it comes to British immigration, it's the Jews that were, pulling the puppeteering string, or that it's the case in Canada. And by the way, I'm Jewish and I'm anti-open door policy. So why do you take the example of the one Jew who is for open border, but you don't look at the Jew who's anti-open border? But again, no facts will stop the Jew hating. And that's what's the most disconcerting part of this post-October 7th, is that there is no amount of professorial evidence that I can offer the Jew hater to get him to even reconsider his position. Anything that I say is only proof of how much of a scheming, diabolical parasite I am. How can you win under such an environment?
So what do you do and how do you respond? I've talked to a bunch of friends, acquaintances, people I've just met over the past several months as they've been dealing with the increase, the openness of it. And I've seen you post thought bubbles or questions or about this. Do you leave Canada? Do you leave North America? I've heard some people say, well, Israel's safer. That is objectively not true at the moment. You may feel safer, but there's still a war going on. You've got Hezbollah about to launch a full-scale attack. But I understand the desire to say, maybe it's time to leave here. Where is your head at on that?
Well, yeah, thank you for that question. I've sat with my wife at exactly that same cafe where earlier I told you that they were picking me up, one of my kids and my wife, and she's looked at me and said, "Where to next, Gad?" Now, imagine that in the 21st century, a Canadian professor who's been fighting for Canadian values, freedom of speech, equal rights. I mean, all the things that any classical liberal person, true liberal, not liberal in the Justin Trudeau sense, but a truly, individual dignity, meritocracy, all of the values that we would think have been enshrined within the Canadian ethos. A professor who's been here since 1975 now looks at his wife, I'm speaking of myself, and says, I think it's time for us to leave. And I'll say this, it's not a secret. My wife and I have been trying to leave for many years now, and there is actually now some escape strategies that are opening up for us. Is that a good thing? Do you think it's, I mean, and I don't mean, I'm not trying to toot my own horn as if like, oh, if Gad were to leave, it's a loss for Canada. But if Gad leaves and 7,000 other people who would add value to Canada leave, and they're replaced by people who come from societies that would not be defending Canadian values the way Gad Saad is, would that be a net benefit to Canada? Well, to Justin Trudeau, it certainly would be a net benefit. But to the average Canadian from whom I receive beautiful letters of gratitude and kindness, that's not a good thing. So to be honest with you, I don't see our future being in Canada, because I think that the demographic realities are such now that it is only going to get worse. And anything that is to reverse those trends would simply be too cataclysmic for Canada to ever implement. I only see us doubling down on our insanity. That's why, by the way, my next book is called Suicidal Empathy, because what happens in many of these progressive policies, it always starts with a miscalibrated sense of empathy, right? I mean, who are we in the United States to stop the noble Guatemalan and El Salvadorian gang members to come into the United States? Don't they have as much of a right to experience the American dream? Well, no, they don't, right?
MS-13? No, not a fan.
Exactly. But see, that's racist of you, because now you're implying that all El Salvadorians are MS-13. No, I'm not. Life is a statistical
No, we're
game.
talking about gang members here.
Exactly. So all of these policies, whether it be policies for the homeless, whether it be immigration policies, whether it be penal policies in terms of how often should a felon get a 75th chance at life, all of these policies are rooted in suicidal empathy. Empathy is great. As an evolutionary psychologist, I study why emotions have evolved and why they can be adaptive. So there is room for envy and empathy and compassion and all of these emotions to exist within the repertoire of the human mind. But the problem arises when empathy misfires, right? When empathy is directed to the wrong target. You and I have evolved to differentiate between jumping in front of a bus to save our own biological children than to save a random kid. That doesn't make us callous. It makes us an evolutionary being. So yes, I want to save all children, but it makes perfect adaptive sense for me to love my child more than a random child. That's why I have a lock on my front door, because while I am empathetic to the homeless, I recognize that I can't let them all into my home. That doesn't make me a nasty, callous person. It makes me a Darwinian being that's able to distinguish between whom I should met this empathy for. The Western progressives don't have that ability to modulate their empathy. That's why we are in the quagmire that we're in.
And why you, along with so many others, are questioning whether they're going to stay here. Gad, it makes me sad to hear that, but I do thank you for your time. You've been very generous. We've probably gone well over time, but it was a great conversation. We'll continue to follow and interact online. Do find them on X and on YouTube and elsewhere. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Brian. Cheers.